Los Angeles, late summer 1968. The Sunset Strip was alive with music pouring out of every club, every window, every passing car. This was the epicenter of West Coast rock, where experimentation wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Where musicians pushed boundaries not because they were rebelling, but because that's what the music demanded. The Whiskey A Go-Go had just closed for the night. It was past 2 a.m., and a small group had migrated to a nearby recording studio for what the owner called after-hour sessions. These weren't formal recordings. They were experiments, jam sessions, places where musicians could try ideas too strange for their record labels, too risky for paying audiences. The studio itself was modest, tucked into a back alley off Sunset Boulevard. You reached it through a narrow staircase that smelled of cigarettes and spilled beer. Inside, the walls were covered with egg carton soundproofing and old concert posters. A Neumann microphone stood in the corner like a relic. The mixing board was secondhand, salvaged from Capitol Records. But the acoustics were perfect. And more importantly, the owner didn't ask questions and didn't charge by the hour. Frank Zappa arrived around 2:30, carrying a briefcase instead of a guitar case. Inside were sheet music, charts, compositions he'd been working on for his next Mothers of Invention album. Zappa was 27 years old and already considered one of rock's most cerebral artists. He didn't just play music. He deconstructed it, satirized it, rebuilt it into something simultaneously more complex and more absurd than what came before. His reputation in LA's music scene was unique. Other musicians respected him, but also kept their distance. Zappa didn't do drugs, didn't drink much, didn't participate in the hedonistic excess that defined the Strip. He observed it, documented it, mocked it in his lyrics. He was the room's conscience and its critic, always watching, always judging, always 3 steps ahead intellectually. Zappa had opinions about everything, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd studied music theory, who understood composition, who could write orchestral arrangements and conduct them. He had little patience for what he considered musical ignorance disguised as innovation. To Zappa, rock and roll was becoming lazy, relying on volume and spectacle instead of genuine musical advancement. Someone mentioned that Jimi Hendrix was supposed to stop by later. Zappa's expression didn't change, but people who knew him recognized the slight tightening around his eyes. He'd seen Jimi perform at the Fillmore a few months earlier and left unimpressed, or at least that's what he told people. Spectacle without substance, Zappa had said afterward to a group of musicians at Cantor's Deli. Impressive guitar gymnastics, sure. But where's the composition? Where's the structure? It's just loud, it's just flash. Take away the volume and the theatrics and what are you left with? A guy bending strings and making faces. These comments had made their way through LA's music scene, the way comments always did. People talked. Musicians gossiped worse than anyone. The city's rock community was small enough that everyone knew everyone, or at least knew of everyone. A dismissive comment at breakfast could reach its target by dinner. So when Jimi walked into that studio around 3 a.m., carrying his Stratocaster in a battered case, there was an undercurrent of tension in the room that he probably felt but didn't acknowledge. A few people glanced between Jimi and Zappa, wondering if either knew what the other had said, wondering if something would happen. Jimi looked tired. He just finished a recording session at TTG Studios that had gone long, trying to capture a guitar tone that existed only in his head. His engineer had finally given up around 2:30, exhausted and out of ideas. His clothes were rumpled, the same purple velvet shirt he'd worn to the session 12 hours earlier. His afro was compressed on one side from wearing headphones. He wasn't in performance mode. He was just a musician looking for other musicians, maybe hoping to play something that didn't have to be perfect, didn't have to be commercial. Mind if I plug in? Jimi asked the room generally, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. Be my guest, the studio owner said, gesturing to an amp in the corner, a Fender twin reverb that had seen better days but still worked. Zappa watched from across the room, sitting at a piano, his briefcase open beside him, sheet music spread across the top. He didn't greet Jimi, didn't introduce himself, just observed with the detached interest of someone studying a specimen under glass. Jimi tuned his guitar by ear, his head tilted slightly, listening to intervals most people couldn't distinguish. The room continued its scattered conversations. Someone was talking about a Doors concert at the Hollywood Bowl where Morrison had shown up 2 hours late and mostly drunk. Someone else was debating whether the Beatles were finished after the White Album, whether they'd lost their experimental edge or found it. Background noise, the comfortable chaos of creative people in a safe space. Then Zappa spoke, his voice cutting through the chatter with surgical precision. "Can you read music?" The room went quiet, not gradually, but all at once, like someone had turned off a switch. It wasn't an innocent question. Everyone there knew it wasn't. Reading music was a dividing line in rock circles. Those who could often look down on those who couldn't, viewing notation as the difference between real musicians and lucky amateurs. Jimmy looked up from tuning. "No," he said simply, no shame in his voice, just stating a fact. Zappa nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already knew, some hypothesis he'd been testing. "Interesting. So when you compose, how do you notate your ideas? How do you communicate complex arrangements to other musicians?" "I don't," Jimmy said. His voice was calm, no defensiveness in it. "I play it, they hear it, we figure it out together. And if you want to recreate the same performance later, if you want to write it down for other musicians to play after you're gone, why would I want that?" Jimmy asked, genuinely curious, as if the question had never occurred to him. "Every time should be different. That's the point. Music should be alive, not frozen." Zappa stood up from the piano and walked over to where Jimmy sat with his guitar. He was holding sheet music, several pages covered in notes, dynamic markings, time signature changes, the kind of complex jazz fusion composition that required real musicianship to execute, the kind that separated professionals from pretenders. "This is composition," Zappa said, holding up the pages like evidence in a trial. "This is how you capture musical ideas with precision. This is how you create something reproducible, something that can outlive the moment. What you do, playing without understanding theory, without being able to write it down, that's not composition. That's just improvisation. It's flash." People in the room shifted uncomfortably. This was more confrontational than the usual musician banter. Zappa's tone wasn't playful. It was pedagogical, like a professor correcting a student who'd given the wrong answer, like someone performing a public service by exposing ignorance. Jimmy looked at the sheet music Zappa held. He couldn't read it, couldn't decode those symbols that meant everything to Zappa and nothing to him. But he didn't look embarrassed. He looked thoughtful, the way someone looks at a map of a city they've already learned to navigate by instinct. "Can I hear it?" Jimmy asked. "Hear what?" "Whatever that is." Jimmy nodded toward the sheet music. "Can you play it for me?" Zappa hesitated. This wasn't what he expected. He'd expected defensiveness, maybe anger, perhaps some mumbled excuse about feeling rather than thinking. Not curiosity, not this calm request. "It's quite complex," Zappa said. "Multiple time signatures, key changes, contrapuntal melodies. It requires significant technical facility." "I'd like to hear it," Jimmy said again, his voice unchanged, patient. Zappa walked back to the piano. He set the sheet music on the stand and began to play. The composition was indeed complex, intellectually demanding, full of odd meters and jazz harmonies that shifted unexpectedly. It sounded deliberately difficult, like music created to prove a point rather than express a feeling. Technically impressive, emotionally distant, the kind of piece that made other musicians nod in appreciation of its cleverness while leaving audiences cold. Zappa played for about 2 minutes, his fingers moving with mechanical precision across the keys, every note exactly where the composition demanded it be. Then he stopped and looked at Jimmy with an expression that said, "See? This is what real music requires." "Now you understand what composition means," Zappa said. "That's structured music. That's not just plugging in loud and bending strings. That's years of study, of understanding how harmony works, how rhythm can be manipulated, how melodies can interact." Jimmy stood up slowly. He walked over to the piano, still holding his guitar by the neck. He looked at the sheet music again, at all those symbols he couldn't read, all those dots and lines and markings that were gibberish to him. "Can you play it again?" he asked. "Just the first part." Zappa played the opening phrase, maybe 8 bars, and stopped. It was a tricky passage with the time signature shifting from 7/8 to 4/4 mid-phrase, something Zappa had worked hard to make sound natural. Jimmy walked back to his amp. He adjusted the volume, rolled the tone knobs on his Stratocaster down slightly. Then he played what Zappa had just played on piano. Note for note, but on guitar. He'd heard it once and absorbed it completely, translating it from piano to guitar in his head, finding the voicings, understanding the intervals. The room was silent now, everyone watching. Someone had been about to light a cigarette but forgot, the lighter frozen halfway to their mouth. Zappa's expression changed slightly, still controlled, but something had shifted behind his eyes. The confidence wavered, just for a second. "Again," Jimmy said quietly. "The next part." Zappa played the next section, more complex, with the time signature shift Zappa was particularly proud of. A rhythmic trick he'd borrowed from Stravinsky and adapted for rock instrumentation. Jimmy listened, his eyes half closed, his body swaying slightly to internalize the rhythm. Then he played it back, but this time he didn't just replicate it. He bent notes where Zappa had played them straight. He added a slight vibrato that made the mechanical precision suddenly feel emotional. He was playing Zappa's composition, but he was also making it breathe, giving it a pulse it hadn't had before. "Keep going," Jimmy said. Zappa played the entire piece now, all the way through. 2 minutes of complex, mathematically precise music. Jimmy listened with his eyes closed, his fingers moving slightly on the fretboard, mapping it out silently, his mind creating a guitar arrangement in real time. When Zappa finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Jimmy began to play. He played Zappa's composition from memory, every note, every change, every quirky rhythmic shift. But what came out of his guitar wasn't a reproduction. It was a transformation. Where Zappa's version was cerebral and precise, Jimmy's version was the same notes played with a different soul. He made the complex time signatures feel natural instead of intellectual. He made the jazz harmonies cry instead of just impress. He found an emotional center in music that had been written to showcase technique. And then, about halfway through, Jimmy started to diverge. He kept the structure Zappa had created. The framework was still there, but he began adding his own voice into it. A bend here that Zappa's composition didn't call for, but somehow belonged. A harmonic there that wasn't in the original, but felt inevitable once heard. He was improvising within Zappa's structure, showing that the two things Zappa had separated, composition and improvisation, weren't opposites. They were partners. They needed each other. The complexity was still there, all of Zappa's intellectual architecture intact, but now it had weight. Now it meant something beyond its own cleverness. By the time Jimmy finished, he'd taken Zappa's intellectual exercise and turned it into something that made people in that room feel something. Not just admire, feel. The composition was still there, all of Zappa's clever ideas intact. But now it had emotional weight, human warmth, a reason to exist beyond proving a point. Jimmy set his guitar down gently and looked at Zappa. "That was beautiful," Jimmy said, and he meant it. "Thank you for playing it for me." Zappa didn't respond. He stood at the piano, staring at Jimmy like he was recalculating an equation that had given him an impossible answer, like a mathematician discovering his proof had a flaw he'd never noticed. Someone in the room started to say something, but Zappa held up a hand for silence. He sat back down at the piano and just stared at the keys, not playing, just looking at them like they might offer an explanation. The session ended shortly after. People drifted out, sensing that something significant had happened, but not quite sure how to process it, not sure what they'd witnessed. Jimmy packed his guitar and left without ceremony, just a quiet goodbye to the room, unaware that he'd just changed someone's entire perspective on music. Zappa stayed at that piano for another 20 minutes, alone in the empty studio, not playing, just sitting there in the dim light. In the days that followed, people who knew Zappa noticed a change. He became quieter in conversations about music, less quick to dismiss other artists, less certain in his pronouncements. He started talking about Jimmy differently, not with dismissal, but with something closer to confusion, like he was working through a problem he hadn't solved yet, a puzzle that didn't fit his usual frameworks. A week later, Zappa was interviewed for a local music magazine. The interviewer asked him about Jimi Hendrix, probably expecting the critical comments Zappa was known for, the sharp observations that made good copy. Instead, Zappa was quiet for a long moment, unusual for someone who usually had immediate answers to everything. I was wrong about him, Zappa finally said, each word chosen carefully. I thought composition and improvisation were separate skills. I thought reading music was necessary for real musicianship. Jimmy showed me that's not true. He has a compositional sense that doesn't require notation. He hears structure in ways that don't fit into traditional theory. And honestly, watching him play my composition back to me, making it better than I'd written it, that was humbling. The interviewer pressed him. But you've always said that technical knowledge is essential. It is essential for me, Zappa clarified, but there are multiple forms of musical intelligence. I was measuring Jimmy by my standards and calling him lacking. That was arrogant. He's not lacking, he's different. And in some ways, he's freer than I'll ever be because he's not constrained by notation, by rules, by the need to write everything down. He just plays what he hears in his head, and what he hears is extraordinary. Years later, in a 1987 interview for Musician magazine, Zappa was asked if he remembered that night in the studio. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile from someone known for sardonic detachment. I remember trying to prove a point and having the point proven wrong, Zappa said. I played something deliberately complex, something designed to be difficult, something that would expose his limitations. And Jimmy heard it once and played it back better than I'd conceived it. That should have made me angry. Instead, it made me reconsider what I thought I knew about music. Some people learn through theory, some learn through listening. Jimmy was the best listener I ever encountered. He could hear intention, not just notes. He could hear what I was trying to say, even when my composition was getting in the way of saying it. The interviewer asked if that changed how Zappa composed. Absolutely, Zappa said. After that night, I started asking myself if my compositions were serving the music or just showing off. Sometimes they were just showing off. Jimmy taught me that complexity without emotion is just mathematics, and mathematics isn't music.